The Roman Empire was a colossus the world has not seen before or since. As I said, at its height, it stretched from Scotland to the Sahara. It embraced North Africa, the Middle East, most of Europe. At the time of the birth of Christ, a Roman citizen could set foot on a trip out of Rome and go in any direction, north, south, east, and west, and travel for weeks, and still be in the Roman Empire where people spoke Latin. And traveling throughout the world wearing a Roman toga had the same cachet, perhaps even more, than carrying an American Express titanium black Krypton card. And they traveled with their Roman version of their Michelin guides and dominated the world. We're not just talking about history here. Remember, 2 millennia ago, you didn't speak French or Bulgarian or Romanian, you spoke Latin. But Rome is very much with us to this day. Most of the Caucasian world speaks a Latinate tongue. You folks actually speak Latin. You didn't know that, I'll bet. But words like placebo, status quo, dictator, Cincinnati, these are all words that would have been familiar to Julius Caesar. That we wear a wedding ring on our fourth left finger reflects the Roman belief that the fourth left finger connected the heart and the mind, and that the father gives away the bride is because in Roman times, father owned his daughters until he gave up ownership to her new husband. The distance between railroad tracks is exactly the distance between the wheels of a Roman chariot. And the chief Roman god, Apollo, his birthday was December 25th. I don't think that's a coincidence. And the Romans, very, very sensitive to any one entity having too much power, created constitutions where there was a division of power, which is part and parcel of all parliamentary democracies today, a division of power, balance of power. The Romans were inordinately successful, and successful for hundreds and hundreds of years, 800 years with the capital in Rome, and then continued on for another 800 years with its capital in Constantinople. So it was successful in its size, in its power, and its durability. Well, how did this come about? And keep in mind from our last lecture that the Mediterranean was hugely underpopulated, with a population of 1/100th what it shows now. So all of this was accomplished by a relatively small handful of gifted people. We'll meet some of these people in our next talk. But let's just look at the overview of what I see to be the key of Roman success. Now, some of my best friends are Italian. But if I were asked to nominate a group of people as most likely to rule the world, my Italian friends would not be the first group that came to mind. So these ancient Romans were obviously of a very special breed. And first and foremost to their success was their ability to assimilate large groups of people, however exotic they could assimilate them. Now look at this, look how different, many exotic groups must have been embraced in this empire. At its peak, 2 million square miles. There were 4,000 cities, and cities of considerable size. 20% of the world's population considered themselves Roman citizens. The Romans built 5,000 miles of roads, roughly equivalent to the U.S. interstate highway system. So this was a vast, successful, polyglot empire. By the way, I was asked whether these two brown circles up here were these two colonial outposts of Rome. And no, they're not. When I was preparing this slide, a couple of drops of Chianti got on the slide. And I thought, given the topic, just as well leave them there. There's one theory about the Barbarian Invasion, that the barbarians at the edge of the empire were getting to taste this Italian wine, and they said, hey, this stuff's pretty good. We've got to get some of that. So it was a vast empire, and the Romans were masters of assimilation. So, for example, if they would decide they were going to embrace a new part of the world, they would knock on the gates, let's say the gates of Croatia. And the governor of Croatia opens the gates, and there is a Roman consul, and he says, "Congratulations, you've just won the opportunity to be part of the Roman Empire." And standing behind him is 50 legionnaires with their shields and their swords. Is he going to say, "No, thank you"? He's going to say, "Oh, no, come right on in." And if he did so, that new part of the world would benefit from being part of the empire. You'd have all the benefits: the security, the education, the clean food and water, the commerce, the stability, the peace, Pax Romana. It was an enormously beneficial thing, and the Romans ruled with a light hand. They didn't so much as occupy as co-opt. They would leave the entire structure of this area that they've just conquered in place. You could keep your mayors, your aldermen, your governors, your way of life, your gods. The Romans, in fact, asked just three things. You pay your taxes on time, you owe your ultimate obedience to Rome, and that you recognize the Roman gods as well as your own. In fact, if the Romans in a new area found a god that maybe served a function that standard Roman gods did not follow, they would adopt your god and add it to the Roman pantheon of gods. The Romans never met a god they didn't like. So they ruled with a very light hand. They would never do, for example, what the Allies did when we moved into Iraq, where we not only knocked out Saddam Hussein, but we completely annihilated the entire governmental structure, right down to the cops and the postmen and the museum curators. So it's not surprising that we got chaos. The Romans were much too wise to do something like that. They leave all those folks in place as long as you, at the top, recognize where the power was. And the Roman legions were so successful that they rarely had to be used. It was just that they were just outside. That was sufficient. The carrots of being part of the Roman Empire was such that they never had to use the stick. But the stick was there if necessary, and it was a mighty stick indeed. The Romans, for 800 years, had absolute military supremacy. Once they defeated Carthage, it wasn't just one of the great superpowers, it was the only superpower in the Mediterranean. And they went, the Greeks, even one better, in introducing a certain degree of flexibility that the Greek phalanx lacked. So they were absolutely unbeatable. Yes, on occasion they would lose a battle. Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, gave them a bloody nose from time to time. But then they would come back with 3 times their numbers, and this time the outcome of the battle would be very different. So they may lose an occasional battle because all the soldiers were dead. The Romans never backed off, but they rarely lost a war. So they were essentially unbeatable. As long as the empire remained manageable, the Romans maintained military supremacy that enabled them to enforce their administrative rule, which, as I say, was unique in its inclusionary. Everybody was welcome. You could become a Roman citizen in a generation. Some of the latter Roman emperors were not born in Italy, but in places like Spain. So that was the second, I think, leg of Roman success. And the third leg that I think makes the Romans unique was its extraordinary engineering skill. The Romans were engineers par excellence. To this day, we're not entirely sure why the Pantheon in Rome remained standing after 2,000 years of earthquakes. Yes, the Romans created the arch and they invented concrete, but they had engineering techniques that we still haven't mastered. And one of the ways in which that was manifest is in the construction of Roman roads. 6,000 miles of them, many of them still in use to this day. The Romans would dig a ditch 6 feet deep, 16 feet wide. They'd fill it with stones, and then they'd layer thick marble slabs on top. They're clearly over-engineered, and these roads were absolutely straight. If the Romans came to a gully, they wouldn't go down the gully and up. They'd fill in the gully or maybe put a bridge across it. They came to a hill, the Roman engineers would knock away the hill so the road would go straight. They wouldn't go up the hill and down the hill. They'd remove the hill. Now, scratch your head, this must be a very expensive technique for road building, and after all, we're dealing with foot traffic here. What do we need a freeway for, a California freeway? And the Romans would argue that they needed speed, that if there was a problem out in the province, they needed these roads to get the Roman legions out in a hurry, and they could march 20 miles a day. Well, if they could march 20 miles in a day, how much more time would it add to go up a hill and down a hill? So I don't think that explanation that they gave really washes. I think, in fact, the reason the Roman roads were straight, irrespective of any natural obstacles, is that it reflected Roman will. This was the Roman personality. We have a God-given mission to rule the world. The Roman way is the best way, and don't put anything in my way. We're going to come out straight ahead. This was Rome. That self-confidence, that masculine fist, I think is reflected in their engineering. Their engineering was important in two other ways as well. I mentioned that Roman cities were enormous. Rome had 1 million people. This was unheard of in ancient times. Athens, at its peak, only had 50,000 people. And the reason was that in ancient times, the land could not support much more than 10, 20, 30,000 people. They didn't have enough water. They didn't have enough food. Well, the Roman roads solved the food problem. Now they could bring food in at great ease. Though these roads were designed for the Roman legions, the merchants quickly saw this as a way of upping commerce, very much like the British railroads, and it was part of Roman prosperity, so they could bring in grains from the Middle East. Rome was not an oil-dependent economy, but it was certainly a grain-dependent economy, and they depended upon Middle Eastern grain, and they made sure that that grain was always available. So these roads made it possible to feed large populations. As for water, the Romans created aqueducts that could bring water 100 miles from where it was in the mountains to where it was needed in the cities, supplying the fountains and the villas. So they solved two of the problems that kept populations in ancient Europe down. But there was a third problem, and that was if you start to crowd people into cities, you get detritus, you get waste, and you get disease. And there's nothing like a good plague every 10 years to keep your population down. In the Renaissance, every 13 years, the Black Plague would come back and decimate, often eliminate half of the population of Renaissance Europe. The Romans solved this problem by building sewer systems. So the fresh water would come in, and then the sewer systems would take out the waste, and that kept these cities clean. And whatever what I say of Rome is true of Ephesus. It's true of all of the cities in the Roman Empire. Their irrigation turned the Sahara and Sinai from deserts into fertile lands. This engineering skill is instrumental in why the Romans were able to succeed in the way that they did. So, their process of assimilation, their military superiority, and their engineering skills. But there is one other factor that I must mention, a darker side of Roman success. And that is that it was built mostly, largely, on the back of slaves. The Roman Empire was a slave empire. They had slaves from all over the empire, and they had categories where they felt different ethnic groups served best. They thought Ethiopians made good accountants. They thought the Greeks made good doctors and lawyers. The British slaves they had very little use for. They were just considered useful only in manual labor. They just didn't seem to have any intellectual heft. So that was the Roman attitude. But in any event, without slaves, obviously, the Romans could not have done anything like what they were ultimately able to achieve. Just to give you one example, many of the villas and certainly all of the Roman baths had hot and cold running water. Now, we know where the cold water came from. Where did the hot water come from? Well, underneath the baths would be these enormous chambers where slaves were working with bellows and coke and charcoal. And these enormous furnaces would heat the marble ceiling, which was, of course, the floor to the bath above. And these marble slabs would get quite hot. The water would run over them and warm, and thus the Romans had hot water as well. The Romans had a military-industrial complex where they used iron to make their shields and their swords, and everyday implements. Let's take a stove, for example. And the stove maker would have to bend these sheets of iron in order to create the stoves that would heat the villas and cook the food. So he'd be working up above, but underneath would be these slaves working in 180-degree temperatures with their bellows and their furnaces in order to heat above so that he could bend the iron. I imagine when the stove maker would go home at the end of the day and his wife would ask him, "How did it go today?" And he'd say, "Oh, what a day. I spent the whole day stoving over a hot slave." It's an old Roman joke. So clearly, this was a remarkable empire, the product of some remarkable people, and we will meet them on our next day at sea. We will look at what life was like if you were just an everyday Roman citizen. And you will find that much of Roman life was almost identical to our lives today. And finally, we will look at how it was that an empire that seemed so durable, so massive, and so successful in so many ways rapidly declined and fell. And lastly, examine whether or not perhaps there is a lesson for us today. So I will see you in about 5 days. Meanwhile, I'm Dr. Martin Blinder, and I want to thank you so much for coming today. Cheers.